Exercise 16 deals with the heart. If we look at the heart anatomy in what's known as the pericardial cavity, that is where the heart is located. The heart itself is going to be surrounded by what's known as the pericardium or the pericardial sac. The superficial surface, the top surface, is located around the third costal cartilage, and it's referred to as the base. And then the inferior tip of the heart is known as the apex, and it's located slightly to the left of the sternum between the fourth and fifth ribs. It's roughly the size of your fist. If you have an enlarged heart, which the causes for that are unknown, or it's referred to as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the heart does act as a pump, and it's composed mostly of cardiac muscle. And so this is a diagram just showing the placement. As you can see, it is slightly tilted towards the left side. For that reason, the left lung, volume-wise, is slightly smaller than the right, because you have to have room for the heart in there. In terms of looking at the anatomy, the heart, as I said, is a pump. It has 4 chambers. The upper chambers are known as the atriums. They are receiving the blood from throughout the body. We'll talk about in a minute which atrium receives blood from which part of the body. And then the ventricles are the bottom chambers. You do have 2 separate circulation circuits. We often study them a little bit separately, the pulmonary and the systemic. The pulmonary refers to the circulation pattern that's going to be moving blood to the lungs and then from the lungs back to the heart again. This is necessary for the gas exchange to occur. And then the systemic circulation pattern is moving blood to the rest of the body other than the lungs, and it's now transporting that oxygen to all of the tissues throughout the body and receiving the carbon dioxide, which is a waste product. So if we look at the pulmonary circulation pattern, what happens here is the blood is going to leave the right ventricle. It will flow through a valve known as the pulmonary semilunar valve. It then moves through the pulmonary trunk, which then shortly after separates. You have the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery. The right pulmonary artery will move to the right lung. The left pulmonary artery goes to the left lung. And then once it's in the lung, you gradually have those arteries, the diameter is going to get smaller and smaller, and it branches. And eventually you end up with the pulmonary capillaries, which is where the gas exchange actually occurs in the lungs. And then from the capillaries, they go to the venules and then the veins. Then from the right lung, the blood is going to leave through the right pulmonary vein. Through the left lung will be the left pulmonary veins. Those will then flow into the left atrium. So you've gone from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart again. With systemic circulation, what happens here is the blood will leave the left ventricle. It moves through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, which then immediately you start having other arteries branching off from that. So the blood's going to flow through various arteries, from the arteries to the arterioles to the capillaries, and then from the capillaries to the venules to the veins, and then back through the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, flow into the right atrium. And so this is just a picture that is showing the flow essentially of these 2 circulatory patterns that are seen in the body. And so up at the top here with the heart itself, you can see in terms of flowing for the pulmonary circulation, here is the right ventricle. It will leave and go right through. Here is the pulmonary semilunar valve. Here's the pulmonary trunk. It then separates and either goes to the right lung or the left lung. And then it will return by the pulmonary veins. Once again, the left side here, right side over here. And those are all going to flow into the left atrium here. And then for the systemic circulation pattern, what's going to happen here now is from, excuse me, from the left ventricle right here, the blood is going to flow right here through the pulmonary, one of the semilunar valves, the aortic semilunar valve. Continue on the back side here, flow up. This is the aorta. It's going to, as you can see, have different arteries branching off, flows around to the rest of the body, and then it is going to return. This is the inferior vena cava here. Way up here at the top, you have the superior vena cava. They are both flowing now into the right atrium to return that blood to the heart. There's a membrane that surrounds the heart. It's called the pericardium. It actually has two layers, as we often will see with organs. It's kind of like you have a membrane. It's like punching your fist in a balloon, and you end up with two layers. The fibrous pericardium is the outer layer. The serous pericardium is the inner layer. You do have serous fluid that's between the two layers of the serous pericardium. This helps to reduce friction because obviously the heart is moving. Anything moving can create friction, and you want to keep that heat that can be generated down and just reduce the friction altogether. Sometimes you'll see on the surface, outer surface of the heart, it sometimes almost looks like this extension of fat. It's actually called the auricle. It's an extension of the atrium. Atrium is singular, atria is plural, in case you're trying to figure that out. There are grooves on the surface of the heart. These are known as the sulcus. There's usually fat that helps to surround those grooves, providing insulation, cushioning, etc. And what are those grooves for? Those are for what are known as the coronary blood vessels. Coronary is referring to heart, so these are the blood vessels that are feeding the heart itself. The coronary sulcus disc is between the atrium and the ventricles. The anterior interventricular sulcus is, just break the word down. Anterior, means on the front, so it's on the anterior surface. And then, sorry, change my color. Just look at the words. So as I just said, anterior, basically front, interventricular, right here. What does that mean? That means between. So it's between the ventricles on the front side. The posterior interventricular, once again, posterior is back, interventricular right here. It means between those ventricles. So when you look at the diagrams of the heart, you can see right up here is the coronary sulcus between the atrium and the ventricle, and then this is the interventricular, this is the anterior, and here's the posterior back here in terms of those surface structures. And we will be seeing this picture throughout for different features that we are looking at. When we look at the internal structures of the heart, there is the interatrial septum. This is separating the right atrium from the left atrium. There is a structure that is, or a marker here, that's a remnant of something that happens before birth. There is an opening between those two. Before birth, it's known as the foramen ovale. As soon as birth occurs, there's a flap that covers this hole, and that remnant is known as the fossa ovalis. Sometimes it doesn't close properly, and that's what sometimes with a newborn you might hear about them having a hole in the heart. It's usually this that they're referring to. It doesn't close properly. The interventricular septum, now you're talking about what is separating the right ventricle from the left ventricle. This is very much thicker than the interatrial septum because the pressure is higher here. So you have to be able to deal with that. You do have 4 valves within the heart. You have 2 that are known as the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves for short. This is a valve that is going to be between the atrium and the ventricle. So you have one between the right atrium, right ventricle, and one between the left atrium and left ventricle. Now, collectively, we call them the AV valves. Specifically, they have different names. The AV valve that is found on the right side is the tricuspid valve. On the left side, between the left atrium and left ventricle, it has two names. It can be known as either the bicuspid or the mitral valve. The other two valves that we have in the heart are the semilunar valves, and these are going to be between the ventricle and then the artery that is leaving the heart. So you have a pulmonary semilunar valve, that's between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and then the aortic semilunar valve, which is between the left ventricle and the aorta. So if we are looking at the diagram here, you can see, let me put this in a different color so we can hopefully see it a little bit better. Here is the interventricular septum. Notice how thick it is. Your valves, right here is the tricuspid valve. Right here is the mitral or bicuspid valve. This is right here is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And back here right behind it, you can see just a little part of it is the aortic semilunar valve. So the right atrium is receiving blood from three main veins. So veins are bringing blood back to the heart. Arteries are taking blood away from the heart. So the right atrium is receiving blood from the superior vena cava, which is basically draining blood, returning it anything above the diaphragm. The inferior vena cava is bringing blood from below the diaphragm. And then the coronary sinus, this is bringing the blood from the heart itself. Because remember, the heart is obviously very actively working tissue. It's an organ. It's pumping. It needs its own blood supply as well. And that's one thing that some people tend to forget about. So the coronary sinus is returning the blood that has been transferred, that's bringing oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. It's returning it now to the right atrium. The right ventricle, the blood is going to flow from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle, one thing that we do see with this tricuspid valve is, and we will see it also with the bicuspid valve on the left ventricle, are these strands. They look like tiny pieces of string almost. It's called the chordae tendineae. And these strands, they're attached to the flaps of the valve. They keep the flaps, if you will, from flipping back up into the atrium. So it's helping to keep everything positioned properly. There are those strands. The other end is from one end is attached to the flap, and then the other end is attached to a muscle that's known as papillary muscles. If you do a heart dissection, you can usually very easily see these. So what is the right ventricle going to do? It's going to pump the blood to the lungs for that gas exchange to occur. And on this diagram, you can see where the papillary muscles are labeled. You can definitely see those strands that we were just talking about that are the chordae tendineae. And so that's what these little strands right here are. That's what all of those are. It just kind of looks like sewing thread almost. With the left atrium, it's receiving blood from both the right and left pulmonary veins. There's two right pulmonary veins, two left pulmonary veins. So those four veins, the blood flows from there into the left atrium. It's coming back from the lungs, so it's very high concentration of oxygen, low concentration of carbon dioxide. From the left atrium, it's going to flow through that bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. Now, with the left ventricle, you have the chordae tendineae. Now, there's only going to be two papillary muscles, not three, which is part of where the name bicuspid comes from. One thing you will notice if you do a heart dissection is that the walls of the left ventricle are much, much thicker than the right. And the reason for that is because the right ventricle only has to pump the blood right next door to the lungs, so it doesn't have to go very far. But the left ventricle has to pump that blood all the way throughout the entire body. So it has to be a much stronger force when it pumps, when it contracts. And so that muscle has to be much thicker to allow for that stronger contraction, more pressure to push the blood out. So those heart valves that we mentioned before, once again, the AV, the tricuspid and bicuspid, and the semilunar, the pulmonary and aortic, those valves help to prevent backflow. It's a huge thing. It's regulating that flow of the blood. So as long as we have this diagram up, I want to just go ahead and um, kind of show you the flow pattern, just as a summary, if you will. So here's the superior vena cava. Blood is coming in this way. Here's the inferior vena cava coming in this way. Remember that fossa ovalis, that remnant? That's what this is right here. So the blood is flowing in there in the right atrium. It's going to flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it flows through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Now it's in the pulmonary trunk. Now it separates and goes either to the left pulmonary artery, to the left lung, or the right pulmonary artery, which is going to go back behind here and out here, to the lungs. Now, from the right lung, the blood is going to return by the right pulmonary veins here. From the left lung, it's going to return from the left pulmonary veins here. These are going to pass around on the back side. So they all end up right here. You are now in the left atrium. The blood is going to flow through the, once again, it's either the bicuspid or mitral valve, whichever you wish to call it. You're now in the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, you're now going to go through the aortic semilunar valve, which passes behind here into the aorta and up around here. Some of it's going to go up this artery, some's going to branch out here, some here, and then down the backside and for the systemic circulation. So what happens is it is a pump. As you can see, you've got the 4 chambers. The 2 upper chambers pump, pushing that blood through those AV valves down into the ventricles. Then the ventricles contract, pushing the blood out through the semilunar valves, out through the appropriate arteries. So you've got the atrium pump, ventricle pump, and this just continues on, moving that blood throughout the body. So this is just an enlarged picture showing the valves. As you can see, the tricuspid has those 3 different flaps, 1, 2, and 3. Each one is attached by the chordae tendineae to the papillary muscle, and the bicuspid has 2 flaps, which are attached to the 2 papillary muscles. And then you've got the semilunar valves as well. And this is just another depiction showing when some are open, some are closed. It's very tightly regulated as to when the valves are opening, when they're closing, relative to when the muscle's contracting. So you get the most efficient pumping of the blood and movement of that blood through the heart. The coronary circulation, I said this is referring to the supplying the heart muscle itself with blood so that it's getting oxygen, nutrients, and removing those waste products. The coronary arteries will branch off from the aorta on the back side, so that's why you often don't see it. The left coronary artery, the circumflex, is going to branch off of it, and it's going to sit in that coronary sulcus, which, remember, coronary sulcus is that groove between the atrium and the ventricles. And then it is also going to then branch off into the anterior interventricular artery. The right coronary artery is going to branch off into some of your marginal arteries. So if you are looking here on the front of the heart, let's see if we can show up. Here is branches off on the back side, as you can see over here, and then up here you've got the circumflex artery, they've had to cut away some of the larger, what we call the great blood vessels. Great blood vessels are usually your superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, pulmonary trunk, and aorta. But you can see how the blood vessels, and usually wherever you have an artery, you've also got the vein that is sitting in those grooves as well. The posterior cardiac vein, small cardiac vein, and middle cardiac vein are all going to drain into what is known as the great cardiac vein, which then drains in the coronary sinus, which then drains into the right atrium. So that's what is returning that blood that's been feeding the heart itself back into the right atrium, into the blood supply. The anterior cardiac veins drain directly into the right atrium from the front side. So this is just kind of a summary slide to show you do need to be familiar once again with these various blood vessels, the chambers, the valves. Don't forget to look at that review on your lab manual that shows exactly which ones you need to know. But as you go down this diagram and look at the different features, one way that may help is to almost kind of like think of it as a road map. That where are you traveling? Well, you're traveling down, if you're a red blood cell, either coming in from the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, flow into the right atrium. As I say this, see if you can picture in your mind, on this diagram where we're at. You flow into the right atrium, from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk, branches to the pulmonary arteries, goes to the lungs for gas exchange to occur. Come back from the lungs, returning to the heart. How? By the pulmonary veins, which drain into the left atrium, through the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it's going to flow through the aortic semilunar valve, through the aorta. And from there, it's going to travel through the systemic circulation, providing oxygen that is just gained from the lungs, nutrients, providing that to all of the various, basically the rest of the body, the various tissues and organs throughout the body other than the lungs. It's going to be basically dropping off the oxygen, dropping off nutrients, picking up waste products, picking up carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, coming back to the heart by way of the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, into the right atrium, through the tricuspid, right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar, through the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, back to the lungs, drop off that waste product of CO2, pick up more oxygen, and it just keeps circling around and around like that. Once again, get a picture that's not labeled. They may have the markings but not the label. Put it in a plastic sleeve and just practice that labeling over and over and over. And that will help you tremendously.